The sound of the approaching attacking vessel, its screws churning in the water as it approaches its underwater target at speed, is clearly audible to the crew. Low-yield depth-charge training rounds were dropped on the submerged submarines to enable the new crews to experience what, for many, would be a real event before too long. There can be little doubt that being depth-charged is one of the most stressful of all experiences encountered by submarine crews. The dull thuds and reverberations of the exploding charge was, as many survivors of such attacks have testified, an awful experience. It took approximately 4 months to work up a new U-boat and its crew. By July 1942, the improvement in Allied measures against U-boats off the eastern seaboard of the US was clearly evident. The employment of convoys and more escorts led to a rapid drop in sinkings. The main threat, however, came from aircraft. More patrols and improved hunting techniques saw all U-boats operating in these waters being attacked from the air. Operation Paukenschlag was cancelled on the 19th of July. The growing effectiveness of Allied air cover now began to dictate Dönitz's tactics. Coverage of the Atlantic sea lanes by long-range aircraft was increasing. From bases in the northern US and Canada, air patrols now extended as far into the Atlantic as shown by the arc. From Greenland, Catalinas and Hudsons carried air coverage as far as is shown by this arc, whereas Sunderlands, Catalinas and Liberators from the UK were able to extend coverage into the eastern Atlantic as far as is shown here. It was into the remaining gap, known to the Germans as Devil's Gorge, that Dönitz redirected his primary submarine campaign in the second half of 1942. Even so, sinkings in June had amounted to 778,000 tons and in July to 504,000 tons. Whilst these were impressive figures, they were nevertheless below the total needed to bring about the fatal damage to the Allied war effort. Moreover, it is clear that the Germans were at last waking up to the sheer scale of the US shipbuilding program. In 1941, the Naval Staff had estimated the total US output would not exceed 2.5 million tons per annum. 1 year later, this construction estimate was raised to the staggering total of 15.3 million tons over the years 1942 and 1943. Even though the renewed campaign in the mid-Atlantic in the latter part of 42 would net a huge toll of enemy vessels, Dönitz would have been profoundly disturbed to have discovered that as early as July, new ship construction exceeded sinkings for the first time since the onset of the war. Although many dark months still lay ahead, if there was one point in the long drawn-out Atlantic campaign when it could have been said that Dönitz had lost his war, this was it. Nevertheless, new patrol lines were drawn up. The convoy assault reopened on August the 5th with a 5-day running attack by 18 U-boats on the 33-strong convoy SC-94. By the time it reached UK air cover, 11 ships had been sunk for a cost of 2 submarines lost and 4 damaged. The tempo of pack attacks on convoys grew in the following months. SC-107 was attacked on the 1st of November, and by the 6th, when the contact was broken off, 15 vessels totaling 88,000 tons had been sunk. November was the pinnacle of success in the whole U-boat campaign, with a total of 729,000 tons being sent to the bottom.
Vorsichtiger Rundblick. Die Luft ist wieder rein. Einer der torpedierten Dampfer schwimmt noch auf seiner Ladung.
The U-boat successes in the Atlantic during this period were helped by the withdrawal of escorts from the convoys to assist in the protection of the Allied shipping used in Operation Torch. German cameramen were once again on hand to record the homecoming of the latest batch of victorious U-boat commanders. Returning to Saint-Nazaire in U-130, a Type 7 boat, is Captain zur See Ernst Cowles, who was awarded the Knight's Cross on the 1st of September 1942 for sinking 115,000 tons of shipping in the Atlantic. U-108 entered port at Lorient after a long cruise lasting from the 13th of June through to the 10th of October 1942. Commanded by the experienced Fregattenkapitän Klaus Scholz, he had been awarded his Knight's Cross on the 26th of December 1941. Late 1942 saw a peak in film coverage of these events, as by mid-1943 heavy losses saw fewer boats return to port to be greeted by full military bands and laurels for the boat's commanders. It is a remarkable indictment of the ineffectiveness of Germany's military intelligence that when Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, took place in late 1942, the German Supreme Command hadn't a clue. Given the extremely large numbers of vessels needed to both transport and protect the troops, it is difficult to understand how they could have been missed. The answer would seem to lie in the very blinkered notions the Germans had concerning Allied intentions. If a landing was to take place, it was expected on the Iberian Peninsula. The upshot of this total surprise was that there were no significant numbers of U-boats to hand to contend with the invasion fleet. Almost all that could have been employed were operating in the Atlantic, inflicting losses on Allied convoys. They could only have been redeployed to contend with the Allied forces had the Germans known of Torch in advance. Certainly no U-boats were diverted from the Atlantic in the weeks before Torch. Even those boats operating in the Mediterranean were not on hand. Given, however, the large numbers of escorts attached to the troop convoys, it seems reasonable to suppose that the U-boats would have found it extremely difficult to intercept the fast-moving and well-protected vessels, no matter how many there were. The possibility of interception by U-boats was one of the concerns of the Allies when embarking on the enterprise. It was at Casablanca in Morocco that Churchill and President Roosevelt and their staffs came to the agreement that the prosecution of the war against the U-boat was the first charge on the United Nations. Absolute priority would now be allocated to containing the U-boat menace and winning the Battle of the Atlantic. A little over a month later, the failure of a sortie by the cruisers Admiral Hipper and Leipzig precipitated a change of leadership in the German Navy. Beside himself with rage over their failure to sink an Arctic convoy, Hitler demanded that Raeder decommission the big ships and, on the 6th of January, asked how this would affect the building of more U-boats. Raeder responded by emphatically declaring that the surface vessels must stay. Hitler demanded again on the 26th of January that they be decommissioned and their dockyard capacity be made available for U-boats. Raeder now had little recourse but to resign, which he did on the 30th of January. Hitler appointed Dönitz in his place. Karl Dönitz had now achieved the highest office available to an officer in the German Navy and set about moulding it in his image. In his unequivocal first message to the fleet, he stated that the war was now a U-boat war. Although transferred to Berlin, he also took the headquarters of U-boat command with him and continued to personally oversee the campaign in the closing 2 years of the war. In Hitler's eyes, the U-boat campaign now represented the only bright point in Germany's fortunes as he wrestled to contend with approaching disaster in Russia and Tunisia. It was the latter that took up Dönitz's attention when he made his first official visit to Italy in his new role in March. He had been personally sent by Hitler to sound out Mussolini, an indication of the trust the Führer placed in him. In addition to the ceremonial, he also spoke to the Italians concerning the dire situation in Tunisia, where all hopes of a favourable Axis military solution were rapidly fading. Dönitz became a regular attendee of Hitler's conferences at his headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia. Seen here in the company of Göring, Keitel and other members of the Nazi hierarchy, Dönitz was a welcome and valued member of Hitler's court. Hitler's disillusion with Göring, stemming as it did from the failure of the Luftwaffe, was more than matched by his growing regard for the new commander of the Navy. Dönitz's star was clearly in the ascendant. Although the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic would soon be eclipsed, his own rise to national prominence would see him emerge as Hitler's chosen successor.